The doctor stood over the motionless boy, pocketing the grieving father's gold, and pronounced the child's legs dead forever. He never noticed the scarred laundress standing in the shadows. He never noticed her calloused hands tightening around the soiled bedsheets, or how she caught the bitter, unmistakable scent of belladonna clinging to the rim of the boy's evening teacup. The town thought it was a tragic wasting disease. They whispered that the widower's son was simply fading away, cursed by bad blood. They were entirely wrong. This wasn't a disease. It was a slow, calculated theft masked as medicine. It was poison, dripped nightly by the very authorities trusted to heal him. Before the week is out, this broken woman will drag their greed into the harsh light of day, and the vengeance she delivers will be so quiet, so perfectly undeniable, that it will leave the entire town frozen in absolute shock. Before we uncover the dark secret hidden in that medicine bottle, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The heat of the laundry room had been Martha's entire life for 10 years. The heavy cast iron presses, the boiling vats of caustic lye, the dense steam that curled the wallpaper and warped the floorboards. It was here, amidst the scalding water, that the accident happened. A ruptured copper boiler, a blinding flash of pressurized steam. When the bandages finally came off, the left side of her face was a landscape of twisted, raised red flesh. She did not complain. She returned to the washboards the very next day. Her hands still knew the work, but hard work was no longer enough. The master of the house, a man who loudly preached charity every Sunday, stood in the doorway of the laundry. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the wet floor. He handed her a small, coarse canvas pouch. 3 silver coins clinked inside, severance for a decade of burned fingers and aching shoulders. "My wife cannot bear to look at you, Martha," he said. His voice was perfectly even, perfectly cruel. "The parlor guests are frightened, you understand. We need someone presentable." Martha looked at the 3 coins. They did not equate to 10 years of loyalty. They did not pay for the skin she had left on his cellar floor. She did not argue. Pleading was a currency she did not possess. She wiped her raw, cracked hands on her apron. She untied the heavy strings at her waist. She folded the thick, wet cotton neatly, placing it on the edge of the ironing board. She walked out the back door. The cook, a woman she had shared quiet evening meals with for thousands of nights, turned her face away toward the stove. The town sheriff stood by the back gate, leaning his weight on the iron fence. He was there to ensure she didn't steal the good silver on her way out. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt right as she passed. "Keep moving, Martha," the sheriff grunted, his hand resting lazily on his belt. "Ain't no place for monsters in a decent town. Keep walking." She did not look back. The iron gate clicked shut behind her. A definitive metallic sound. It severed her from the only world she knew. The wind out on the open plains was not like the wind in the town. Out here, it carried no smell of baking bread or warm wood smoke. It carried dry dust. It carried ice. Martha paid one of her silver coins to a passing freighter. The man was hauling rough-hewn timber to the western ridges. He pointed a thick, calloused thumb toward the flatbed. "Sit in the back. Keep out of my sight." She climbed up. The raw wood was rough. Splinters caught at her thin gray wool skirt. The heavy wagon lurched forward. Every violent bump in the rutted road shot a dull, electric ache up her spine. The cold settled into her bones, a deep, persistent throb that she welcomed. It kept her awake. The landscape flattened out into an endless, punishing stretch of dying yellow grass. The sky above was the color of a bruised iron skillet. She did not cry. Crying did not warm a freezing room. Tears only froze on the cheeks and cracked the skin. She pulled her worn, moth-eaten shawl tighter around her shoulders. She kept her rough hands folded squarely in her lap. She watched the dust rise from the heavy wagon wheels. The pale dust coated her heavy leather boots. It settled into the deep, tight ridges of her facial scar. She let it. It was a layer of armor against the world they rode for 2 brutal days. The freighter threw her a single stale piece of hardtack biscuit at sunset. She picked it up from the floorboards. She chewed it slowly. Her jaw worked with a mechanical, survivalist rhythm. The tasteless starch turned to thick paste in her mouth. She swallowed it down with a meager mouthful of metallic-tasting water from a rusted tin canteen. On the late afternoon of the 3rd day, the freighter violently pulled the reins. The horses halted. The wooden wheels groaned against the dirt. "End of the line for your coin," he called back. He didn't bother to turn around. Martha stood up. Her joints popped. Her muscles were rigid from the freezing nights spent on raw timber. She climbed down from the wagon. Her heavy boots hit the hard-packed earth with a dull thud. "There's a ranch 3 miles down that track," the freighter muttered, finally glancing back at her. He flinched visibly at her scar, his eyes darting quickly away. "Belongs to a man named Elias. Needs a cook, needs a maid, needs a damn miracle from what they say. Reckon he won't care what you look like. Ain't nothing pretty out there anyway." The freighter snapped the reins, the wagon rolled away. The massive silence of the plains rushed in immediately to fill the space it left behind. It was absolute, deafening. Martha stood alone on the dirt track. She looked at the desolate horizon. 3 miles. It was just a distance. It was just walking. She picked up her small canvas travel bag. The handles were frayed. She began to walk, 1 foot in front of the other. The bitter wind whipped her heavy skirt around her ankles. The cold bit fiercely at her exposed face. The scarred tissue throbbed, pulling tight and numb over her cheekbone. She ignored it. She measured the journey entirely by the rhythm of her boots hitting the frozen dirt. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The 3 miles took 2 hours. The sun began to dip below the jagged tree line, bleeding a dull, bruised purple across the sky. The temperature dropped sharply. Frost began to form on the edges of the dry grass, brittle and sharp like shattered glass. Martha's breathing remained steady. In, out. A plume of white vapor with every exhalation. Her left leg dragged slightly, a phantom ache from the damp cold, but she did not stop to rest. Resting meant freezing. Eventually the dirt track ended. It bled out into a wide, barren clearing. This was the void. There was no welcoming gate. The split-rail fence was rotting, leaning heavily to the left, tired and defeated by the wind. Beyond it sat the ranch. It was a structure built purely for survival, completely devoid of affection. The timber was gray and weather-beaten, stripped of whatever paint it once held. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. There were no flowers planted by the steps. There were no white lace curtains in the windows. The glass panes were dark, coated in years of undisturbed grime. A rusted iron weather vane spun erratically on the roof, shrieking a high metallic protest against the wind. It was the only sound of movement in the entire expanse. Martha stopped at the edge of the property line. She surveyed the decay. A normal woman would have turned back. A normal woman would have feared the deep, suffocating isolation that hung over the property like a heavy iron shroud. Martha merely adjusted her grip on her canvas bag. It was isolated. Isolation meant no staring eyes. Isolation meant quiet. She stepped onto the property. The ground was hard, frozen solid under her boots. A broken wagon wheel lay half buried in the dirt, abandoned to the elements. Near the barn, a water trough was frozen over, a thick block of dirty ice. A solitary, emaciated hound emerged from under the porch. It did not bark. It merely stared at her with milky, hollow eyes, then lowered its head and crawled back into the dark. It knew the futility of making noise here. Martha approached the front steps. The wood was splintered. She climbed them slowly. Her boots made heavy, hollow thuds on the porch. She stood before the heavy oak door. It was scarred with deep gouges, weather-beaten and sealed tight. She raised her fist. Her knuckles were red and raw from the cold. She knocked twice. The sound was flat, dead. It did not echo. She waited. The wind howled around the corners of the porch, biting through her thin shawl. She did not knock again. Begging for entry was not in her nature. She simply stood there, an immovable object against the freezing gale. Minutes bled into the bitter air. Just as the last sliver of purple light died on the horizon, plunging the porch into deep shadow, the heavy iron latch clicked. The door pulled inward with a long, agonizing groan. A man stood in the threshold. He blocked the meager light coming from a single oil lamp deep within the house. He was tall, but his posture was stooped, carrying an invisible, crushing weight. He wore a faded flannel shirt, dusted with flour and wood ash. He did not speak. He looked at her. Martha did not lower her head. She met his gaze directly. She let the dim light fall completely on her face. She offered no apology for the twisted red scar that dominated her left cheek. She offered no soft smile. She simply presented the reality of herself. The man's eyes were the color of slate. They were completely empty. There was no shock when he saw her face. There was no pity. There was simply nothing. He was a man who had already seen the worst the world had to offer, and a burned face was barely a footnote. "The freighter said you needed a hand," Martha said. Her voice was raspy from the cold, but steady. It held no tremor. "I can cook, I can clean, I can take the heat." The man stared at her for a long, silent moment. He looked at her frayed bag. He looked at her raw, ungloved hands. He looked at the frost clinging to the hem of her skirt. He did not ask her name. He did not ask for references. "The work is hard," he finally said. His voice was like grinding stones, dry, hollow. "The pay is a roof and 2 meals." "I accept," Martha said. He stepped back into the shadows. He left the door open just enough for her to enter. "Wipe your boots," he commanded softly, walking away into the gloom. Martha stepped over the threshold. She closed the heavy oak door behind her. The click of the iron latch was final. The biting wind was cut off instantly. The silence of the house rushed in. It was a different kind of cold in here. Not the freezing bite of the wind, but the damp, stagnant chill of a home that had forgotten how to live. It smelled of stale oats, old ash, and a deep, festering grief. She set her bag on the floor. She wiped her boots on the rough burlap sack by the door. She did not look for a welcoming fire. She did not expect a warm cup of tea. She simply looked for the kitchen. The exile was complete. She had arrived at the bottom of the world. Now, the real work would begin. The kitchen was a graveyard of cold iron and grease. Martha stood in the center of it, the frayed handles of her bag cutting into her palms. Elias lit a single oil lamp and set it on the heavy oak table. The light threw long, skeletal shadows against the soot-stained walls. "I am Elias," he said. He did not offer his hand. "Martha." He pointed to a narrow door adjacent to the pantry. "Your room. There is a cot, a wool blanket, no fireplace. You will rely on the heat from the kitchen stove." Martha nodded. She required nothing more. "Breakfast is at 5. Before the sun rises," Elias continued. His voice was a flat, mechanical drone. "Dinner is at 6. The well is out back. The wood needs chopping. The floors need lye." He stopped. His throat worked as he swallowed heavily. A microscopic fracture appeared in his stoic facade. "The laundry," he rasped, "is placed in a woven basket at the bottom of the stairs every Tuesday and Friday morning. You will wash it separately. You will boil the sheets twice." Martha watched his slate-gray eyes. They were fixed firmly on the floorboards. "The final rule," Elias said. The fracture vanished. His voice turned into iron. He lifted his gaze, staring directly into the scarred wreckage of her face. "The stairs. There is a room at the far end of the upper hall. The east room." He stepped closer. He smelled of old sawdust, horse sweat, and a deep, festering exhaustion. "You do not clean it. You do not knock on that door. You do not look inside. You stay away from the east room. Do you understand?" "Yes," Martha said. Elias turned on his heel. He walked away into the darkness of the hall. He climbed the stairs. His heavy boots pounded against the wood. He stopped at the top, opened a door, and locked it behind him. The heavy silence of the house settled back into place. Martha did not inspect her new room. She walked over to the massive dead cast iron stove. She ran her rough finger along the cold metal top. It was coated in a thick layer of rancid grease and ash. She untied her worn shawl. She rolled up her sleeves. The sanctuary of chores had begun. At 4 a.m, the freezing air of the plains was a physical blow. Martha stood in the yard, her breath pluming white in the darkness. The wooden handle of the splitting axe was heavily splintered. She gripped it anyway. She swung. The heavy iron blade bit violently into the frozen pine log. The wood split with a sharp, violent crack. It sounded like a gunshot echoing across the dead valley. She swung again and again. Her shoulders burned. The muscles in her back screamed in protest. The old burn scars on her face pulled taut and throbbed in the sub-zero wind. She welcomed the pain. Physical pain was a ledger. It could be tracked. It could be understood. It could be managed. It was nothing like the unpredictable hollow ache in the human chest. She chopped until a massive pile of firewood sat stacked perfectly by the back door. Her palms were rubbed raw. A blister burst on her thumb. Warm fluid seeped into the rough wood of the axe handle. She ignored it. She gathered the heavy logs in her apron and carried them inside. She built the fire. The stove roared to life. Heat slowly flooded the kitchen, pushing back the damp chill. By 5 o'clock, the rich smell of salted pork, fried potatoes, and bitter black coffee filled the lower floor. Elias came downstairs. He sat at the scrubbed oak table. He did not look at her. He ate mechanically, shoveling the food into his mouth for pure fuel. He drank the scalding coffee without flinching. He stood up. He left a single dull silver coin on the table for flour. He walked out the door toward the barn. Martha began to scrub. She filled the heavy galvanized bucket with boiling water. She dropped in a block of harsh, caustic lye soap. It hissed as it melted. She dropped to her knees on the hard wooden floorboards. She took a stiff bristle brush. She scrubbed. The lye water burned the small cuts on her hands. The heat turned her skin a bright, angry red. She scrubbed the black soot from the baseboards. She scrubbed the years of grease from the table legs. She scrubbed until her shoulders ached with a dull, sickening fire. The rhythmic sound of the stiff bristles against the wood became her metronome. It kept her mind entirely empty. It kept the memories of the judgmental town completely shut out. Work was not a burden to Martha. Work was a fortress. 7 days bled into one another. The harsh rhythm was firmly established. Wake, chop, cook, scrub, boil, sleep. The house slowly began to change. The oppressive grime disappeared. The floors began to show the pale, natural grain of the wood. The windows were wiped clean of dust, letting in the stark, gray light of the plains. Elias noticed. He said absolutely nothing, but he began eating larger portions. He started leaving his mud-caked boots on the porch instead of tracking dirt inside. They were small, silent acknowledgments between two people who had forgotten how to speak. Then came Tuesday. Martha woke at her usual hour. She walked into the dark hallway to retrieve the firewood. At the bottom of the staircase sat a woven wicker basket. It was full of soiled linens. Martha approached it slowly. She knelt down on the cold floor. She pulled back the top layer of cloth. The sheets were not the rough, spun wool that Elias slept on. They were fine, expensive cotton. They were tiny, sized for a child's bed. She picked one up. It was heavy with dampness. It smelled of stale sweat, sickness, and fear. She held the ruined cloth in her calloused red hands. She tilted her head up. She looked up the long, dark, narrow staircase. At the very end of the hall, the heavy oak door of the east room remained tightly shut. Suddenly, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning silence. A heavy, expensive carriage was rolling quickly up the dirt track toward the house. The isolation was over. The heavy black carriage halted near the frozen water trough. The horses were sweating, their breath pluming violently in the freezing air. They were expensive animals entirely out of place in this graveyard of a farm. Elias stepped out from the barn. He stopped, his broad shoulders visibly slumped. The defiant man who swung heavy axes into frozen pine suddenly withered. He took off his hat. He stood in the bitter wind, looking at the carriage like a condemned man awaiting the executioner. The carriage door opened. A woman stepped down. Her boots were polished black leather. Her dress was heavy, deep violet wool, trimmed in pristine white fox fur. The heavy, suffocating scent of rosewater and lavender perfume cut through the crisp, metallic smell of the winter plains. She was Clara, the sister-in-law, the caretaker. Behind her emerged the town doctor. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat and a silver pocket watch chain that gleamed sharply in the gray light. He carried a large, swollen leather medical bag. It looked heavy. It looked expensive. Martha stood on the porch. She held a heavy wooden bucket of dirty mop water. She did not move. Clara looked at the rotting fence. She looked at the peeling wood of the porch. Then her eyes fell upon Martha. The wealthy woman froze. A look of profound physical revulsion twisted her powdered face. She pulled her fur collar up over her nose, as if Martha's scarred cheek emitted a foul odor. "Good Lord, Elias," Clara's voice was high, sharp, and aristocratic. It pierced the quiet of the ranch like a rusty nail. "What is that thing on your porch? Could you not find a creature with a whole face to scrub your floors?" Elias did not look at Martha. He kept his eyes on the dirt. "She washes the clothes, Clara," Elias muttered. His voice was hollow, stripped of all its low resonance. "She cooks. She comes cheap." The doctor scoffed, adjusting his leather gloves. "Poverty is no excuse for subjecting the boy to such hideous sights. His constitution is already fragile enough. Keep her out of his line of vision, Elias. I will not have my patient's heart rate elevated by a monster." Martha did not flinch. Her breathing remained steady. She gripped the heavy iron handle of the bucket. She walked to the edge of the porch and threw the dirty water onto the frozen dirt. It splashed loudly, steaming in the cold air. She turned her back on them and walked into the kitchen. She did not feel insult. Insult required ego. Martha had boiled her ego away years ago in vats of caustic lie. Heavy footsteps echoed on the porch. The front door opened. Clara and the doctor walked in, bringing the biting wind with them. They did not take off their boots. They tracked dark, muddy slush across the pale, freshly scrubbed pine boards. "The boy needs his treatment, Elias," the doctor said, walking straight toward the stairs. "We are losing ground. His muscular atrophy is accelerating. The paralysis is creeping upward." "I am paying for the best tonics from the city," Elias pleaded. It was the first time Martha had heard emotion in his voice. It was pure, unadulterated desperation. "You said the new syrup would restore feeling to his legs." "Medicine is not magic, Elias," Clara snapped, unpinning her heavy hat. "We are doing the Lord's works, just keeping little Leo breathing. You should be on your knees thanking Dr. Harrison instead of questioning him. Now have your beast boil some water. The doctor requires a clean basin. They climbed the stairs. They walked to the end of the hall. The key turned in the heavy lock of the east room. The door clicked shut. Martha stood by the stove. She looked at the muddy footprints ruining her morning's labor. She picked up her stiff bristle brush. She dropped back to her knees. She scrubbed the floor again. Above her, the floorboards creaked. Heavy footsteps paced. A low, muffled voice spoke in sharp, rhythmic tones. The doctor? Then, a different sound. A high, thin, terrible sound. It was the sound of a child whimpering. It was not a cry for attention. It was a cry of exhausted, hollow suffering. Martha's hand paused on the brush. She stared at the ceiling. The whimpering stopped abruptly. An hour passed. The fire in the stove popped and hissed. Martha filled a heavy copper basin with boiling water and carried it to the bottom of the stairs. She waited. The door upstairs unlocked. The doctor and Clara descended. The doctor's sleeves were rolled up. His hands were damp. He took the fresh basin from Martha without looking at her. "The boy is stabilized," the doctor said to Elias, who stood rigidly in the hallway, "but his legs are entirely unresponsive to the reflex hammer. Complete paralysis. The nerves are dead." Elias closed his eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips. "The new tonics are expensive, Elias," Clara said softly, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. She placed a gloved hand on his arm. "The accounts are draining. You must consider selling the lower pasture to the bank. Little Leo's life depends on it." Elias nodded blindly. "Whatever it takes, just keep him out of pain." He walked to the parlor. He opened a locked wooden box. He handed the doctor a thick stack of green banknotes. The doctor pocketed them swiftly. They left. The carriage rolled away, taking its noise and expensive perfumes back to the town. Martha went back to her work. The wicker basket full of the child's soiled linen still sat by the stairs. She picked it up. She carried it outside to the large iron cauldron in the yard. She lit a fire beneath the heavy black iron. She hauled 3 buckets of water from the half-frozen pump. She dumped the tiny sweat-stained sheets into the cold water. She added the harsh soap. She stood in the biting wind, stirring the heavy wet cotton with a thick wooden paddle as the water slowly began to boil. The steam rose in thick, dense clouds, wrapping around her scarred face. She watched the dark stains lift from the white cloth. She thought of the whimpering child. She thought of the heavy, expensive medical bag. She thought of the mud tracked carelessly across a clean floor by people who claimed to be saviors. The water reached a rolling, violent boil. The heavy bubbles burst on the surface. Martha's face remained a mask of stone. She leaned over the cauldron. The steam carried the scent of the child's sweat. The exile was harsh, but the rules of this house were beginning to reveal themselves. There was a father who was blinded by grief. There were authorities who fed on that blindness. And behind a locked door, there was a child who was paying the price. Martha kept stirring. She would boil the sheets twice, exactly as instructed. She would do the work. She would keep quiet. But the East Room was no longer just a room to her, it was a ledger, and the numbers were not adding up. The steam from the cauldron vanished instantly into the freezing air. Martha lifted the heavy wooden paddle. The tiny cotton sheets slapped against the iron rim, heavily waterlogged and boiling hot. She used a pair of long wooden tongs to transfer the scalding fabric into a wooden rinse tub. Her hands were numb. The harsh lye stripped the natural oils from her skin, leaving her knuckles cracked and bleeding. She did not stop to bandage them. Blood washed out easily with cold water. She wrung the sheets out by hand. It required brutal forearm strength. The wet cotton fought back, twisting tightly into heavy, damp ropes. She carried the heavy wicker basket to the clothesline strung between the barn and the dead oak tree. The wind hit the wet fabric immediately. By the time Martha pinned the first sheet to the wire, the bottom edge had already begun to freeze. It stiffened into a solid sheet of ice. The wind snapped the frozen cotton violently. It sounded like cracking whips. Martha stood back. She watched the tiny frozen squares of white cloth violently snapping in the bitter gale. They looked like surrender flags in a lost war. She turned and went back inside. The evening routine was absolute silence. Elias came in from the barn precisely at 6. The horses were fed. The stalls were shoveled. He washed his hands at the pump, his skin turning purple in the cold, and sat at the kitchen table. Martha placed a cast-iron skillet on the table. Cornbread, salted beef, beans, heavy, dark, utilitarian food. Elias ate without tasting it. His jaw worked mechanically. He stared at the center of the wooden table. He did not look at the empty chair where his wife used to sit. He did not look at the staircase leading to the east room. He simply fueled his body so it could endure another day of punishing labor to pay for the doctor's visits. Martha ate in the corner, sitting on a low wooden stool by the stove. She kept her back straight. She chewed her food slowly. The heat of the iron stove baked into her spine. It was the only warmth she would feel all day. When the meal was done, Elias stood up. He left the plates. He walked to the parlor. He sat in a heavy leather chair by a dead fireplace. He did not light a fire. He sat in the dark. Martha cleared the table. She washed the iron plates. She dried them with a rough flour sack. She put the dry wood into the stove for the night fire. She banked the coals so the house would not freeze completely before dawn. Then she went to her room. The small space off the kitchen was little more than a closet, a narrow canvas cot, a single thin wool blanket. The walls were uninsulated pine boards. The wind whistled through the microscopic cracks, bringing fine dustings of snow directly onto the floor. Martha did not own a mirror. She did not need to see the red, raised skin of her face. She sat on the edge of the cot. She took off her heavy boots. Her toes were white and numb. She rubbed them violently with her calloused hands until the blood returned, bringing a sharp, agonizing ache. She lay down. She pulled the thin wool blanket up to her chin. The cold crept up from the floorboards, settling into her joints. She closed her eyes. She listened. The house spoke in the dark. The wood groaned under the shifting temperatures. The wind hammered the roof. And faintly, filtering down through the heavy floorboards of the ceiling, came the sound of the east room. It was never crying. It was a rhythmic, exhausted shifting. The sound of a small body trying to find comfort in a bed that felt like a cage. Martha's eyes opened in the dark. She stared at the ceiling. The rhythm of her own breathing matched the shifting above. She lay completely still until the shifting stopped. Only then did she allow herself to sleep. The winter deepened. The snow arrived, burying the rotting fence and the dead grass under 2 feet of blinding white powder. The isolation became total. The black carriage from the town could no longer make the journey up the dirt track. For 3 weeks, Dr. Harrison and Aunt Clara did not come. The rhythm of the house altered. Without the weekly visits, Elias grew more restless. He paced the parlor at night. He chopped wood until his hands bled. The medicine bottles left by the doctor were running low. Friday morning, laundry day. Martha carried the wicker basket to the bottom of the stairs. She waited. Elias came down. He carried the bundle of soiled sheets. His face was gray. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He dropped the sheets into her basket. "The medicine is almost gone," Elias muttered to the floor. "I have to ride to town tomorrow. I have to break through the snowpack." Martha looked at the bundle. She looked at Elias. "The doctor said the syrup keeps his heart beating," Elias said. It was a defense, an explanation to an empty room. "If he misses a dose, his lungs will fill with fluid. The paralysis will take his chest." He turned and walked toward the front door. He put on his heavy coat. He took a shovel. He went out to clear a path for the horses. Martha looked down at the basket. She knelt on the floor. She picked up the bundle of sheets. They were damp. But it was not the smell of stale sweat today. The room had been closed for 3 weeks. The sheets had absorbed the concentrated environment of the locked room. Martha held the heavy cotton to her face. She closed her eyes. She inhaled deeply. Her brow furrowed. The scarred tissue on her cheek pulled tight. It was a very specific smell. It was sweet, heavy, and earthy, like rotting dark berries and wet soil. It coated the back of her throat with a thick, bitter residue just from the scent alone. Martha opened her eyes. She let the sheets drop back into the basket. She knew that smell. 10 years working with scalding water, caustic lies, and heavy herbal soaps for the wealthy women of the town had educated her senses. She knew the smell of lavender. She knew the smell of eucalyptus for a weak chest. She knew the smell of mint for a fever. This was none of those. This was Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade. It was an extract used by wealthy women in microscopic drops to dilate their pupils for vanity. It was a muscle relaxant. In heavy, concentrated doses, it did not cure a weak heart. It stopped the muscles from functioning entirely. It induced artificial paralysis. It simulated death. Martha looked up the dark, narrow staircase. The heavy oak door of the east room was locked. Elias was outside in the snow. The pacing of the house stopped. The sanctuary of chores was over. Martha stood up. She wiped her dry hands on her apron. She walked toward the stairs. Elias was outside. The rhythmic, heavy scraping of his iron shovel against the packed snow echoed through the thick walls. He was fighting the winter to save his son. He was fighting the wrong enemy. Martha walked back into the kitchen. She looked at the heavy oak table. Elias's heavy iron key ring sat next to his empty coffee tin. He had taken off his heavy coat from the hook, but left the keys in his exhaustion. Martha picked them up. The metal was freezing against her calloused palm. She walked to the base of the stairs. She looked up into the gloom. The rule was absolute. You do not clean it. You do not knock on that door. You do not look inside. Breaking this rule meant immediate exile back into the freezing plains. It meant starvation. Martha placed her foot on the first wooden step. She climbed in absolute silence. Her heavy leather boots knew how to tread without making the floorboards groan. She reached the top of the landing. The air here was noticeably warmer, trapped beneath the sagging roof, and heavily saturated with the sickly sweet, rotting scent of the nightshade. She stood before the heavy oak door. She slid the largest iron key into the brass lock. It turned with a sharp, heavy clack. Martha pushed the door open. The east room was a tomb. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn completely shut, blocking out the glare of the snow. The air was stifling, thick with dust, and the oppressive heat of a roaring iron stove in the corner. In the center of the room sat a massive carved wooden bed. It looked like a raft adrift in a dark ocean. On the bed lay the boy, Leo. He was 8 years old, but his body was the size of a starved hound. His skin was translucent, the color of skimmed milk. Blue veins mapped across his temples. He lay flat on his back. His arms were pinned rigidly to his sides beneath the heavy quilts. He was awake. As Martha stepped into the room, the boy's eyes snapped toward her. They were wide, terribly wide. The pupils were fully dilated, swallowing the iris entirely, turning his eyes into twin black pits. It was the physical signature of the belladonna poisoning. He saw her face. He saw the twisted red ruin of her scarred cheek emerging from the shadows. A normal child would have scrambled backward. A normal child would have screamed, thrown off the covers, and run for the door. Leo did none of those things. He could not. His brain sent the panicked signals, but his muscles refused to obey. His body remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. Only his chest began to heave with violent, rapid, shallow breaths. A thin, reedy sound of absolute terror vibrated in the back of his throat. He was a prisoner inside his own flesh. Martha did not rush to the bed. She did not speak soft, cooing words. Empty comforts were useless to a child who had learned that medicine was torture. She closed the heavy oak door behind her. She walked to the center of the room. She stopped 6 feet from the bed. She slowly unbuttoned her heavy wool shawl. She let it drop to the floor. Then she sank down. She crossed her legs and sat directly on the dusty floorboards. She lowered her physical height. She placed herself below his eye level. She made herself small. She looked at his heaving chest. She did not make eye contact. Staring was predatory. Instead, she fixed her gaze on his pale, rigid hands resting outside the quilt. She began to breathe. She exaggerated the movement of her own chest, deep, incredibly slow inhalations through the nose, long, steady exhalations through the mouth. She made the sound of her breathing audible in the silent room. In, a slow drag of air. Out, a steady release. Leo's chest was fluttering violently like a trapped bird. Martha ignored his panic. She maintained her own glacial rhythm. She became an anchor of absolute calm in the center of his terror. 10 minutes passed. The iron stove popped. Slowly, imperceptibly, the violent fluttering in the boy's chest began to falter. The human body is designed to mirror its environment. Surrounded by Martha's immovable, rhythmic breathing, Leo's exhausted heart began to yield. His frantic gasps lengthened. His chest rose and fell in time with hers, in, out. When his breathing was finally steady, Martha moved. She did not stand up. She stayed low. She crawled on her knees across the floorboards until she reached the heavy wooden nightstand beside the bed. Leo's black, dilated eyes tracked her heavily. On the nightstand sat a large, amber glass bottle. The label read, Dr. Harrison's Restorative Elixir, for the heart and nerves. Martha reached up. She uncorked the bottle. The heavy, rotting berry smell of Atropa belladonna punched the air. She tilted the bottle. She let a single microscopic drop of the thick brown syrup fall onto the tip of her raw, blistered finger. She brought her finger to her lips. She touched the drop to the tip of her tongue. Within 3 seconds, a cold, heavy numbness spread across her tongue. The muscle went slack. It tasted metallic and bitter. She looked at Leo. The boy was watching her. He knew what was in the bottle. He knew it brought the heavy, suffocating sleep. His eyes pleaded silently from his frozen body. Martha corked the bottle firmly. She looked at the boy. I know, she whispered. Her voice was rough, like dry leaves. It was the first time she had spoken inside this house for anything other than utility. I know. She stood up. She took the amber bottle. She walked to the roaring iron stove in the corner. She opened the heavy iron door. The flames licked outward, hungry and bright. She did not hesitate.
You have no right.
She tossed the heavy amber bottle directly into the center of the fire. The glass shattered instantly. The thick syrup hit the coals, hissing violently and sending up a cloud of dark, foul-smelling smoke that vanished up the chimney. The medicine was gone. The slow murder was stopped. Now the real work of resurrection had to begin. Martha left the east room. She descended the stairs with absolute silence. Outside, the rhythmic scraping of Elias's iron shovel against the snowpack continued. He was clearing a path for a desperate journey to town, a journey to buy more poison. Martha went straight to the kitchen waste bin. She dug through the damp potato peels and old coffee grounds. At the very bottom, she found what she needed, an empty amber bottle of Dr. Harrison's elixir from the previous month. She took it to the sink. She washed it with scalding water and harsh lye soap until the glass was completely sterile. The old smell was eradicated. Next, she went to her narrow freezing room. She opened her frayed canvas bag. It contained no extra dresses. It contained no keepsakes. It contained survival. She pulled out a small, tightly bound leather pouch. Inside were dried, coarse roots she had gathered herself.
How dare you!
Burdock to relentlessly cleanse the blood. White willow bark to numb deep tissue ache. And pure charred birchwood, ground into a fine black powder, to bind and drag heavy toxins from the gut. She returned to the kitchen. She set a small iron pot on the roaring stove. She boiled the water. She added the roots and a heavy pinch of the charcoal powder. She let it violently boil and reduce until it became a thick, dark syrup. It looked exactly like the belladonna. But it smelled of raw earth and fire, not rotting sweetness. She poured the hot liquid into the empty amber bottle. She pressed the cork in tight. She carried it upstairs. Leo was still in the exact same position on the massive bed. His black, dilated eyes tracked her from the doorway. He saw the amber bottle in her hand. A microscopic tremor of pure dread rippled across his jaw. He thought she had changed her mind. He thought she was bringing the suffocating darkness back.
You know why I'm here, Elias.
Martha sat on the floor beside the bed. She uncorked the bottle. "Open," she commanded softly. Her voice was flat. It left no room for negotiation. The boy's lips parted a fraction of an inch. It took immense, terrifying effort. Martha tipped the bottle. A single spoonful of the black, charcoal-laced syrup slid into his mouth. Leo braced himself. He waited for the heavy numbness to coat his tongue. He waited for the terrifying sensation of his lungs forgetting how to breathe. It did not happen. Instead, a sharp, bitter heat bloomed in the back of his throat. It tasted like ash and strong tea. It tasted alive. Martha corked the bottle and placed it deliberately on the nightstand. The visual lie was complete. When Elias came in to check on his son, he would see the bottle. He would believe the horrific medical routine was unbroken. "Now," Martha said, rolling up the heavy wool sleeves of her dress. "We work." She left the room and returned a moment later carrying a heavy wooden bucket filled with boiling water and 3 rough woolen towels. She set the bucket on the floorboards. The steam rose in thick plumes. She pulled back the heavy quilts. Leo's legs were entirely rigid. The muscles had atrophied from months of forced immobility. The joints were locked tight. The skin was ice cold, completely starved of circulation. Martha plunged her raw, blistered hands into the scalding water. She did not flinch. She wrung out a steaming wool towel. She wrapped the boiling hot fabric tightly around Leo's right calf. The boy's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a silent scream. The extreme heat hitting deadened nerves was agonizing. It was like plunging a frozen limb directly into a fire. Martha did not apologize. Pity was useless. Pity did not cure poison.
"You win."
"Breathe," she instructed, her voice a low, steady rumble. She exaggerated her own breathing again. In, out. She wrapped the second scalding towel around his left leg. The room filled with the smell of wet wool and heat. She let the intense temperature penetrate the skin, melting the icy rigidity of the chemically frozen muscles. After 5 minutes, she removed the towels. The skin underneath was bright, angry red. Blood was finally rushing back to the surface. She took his right heel in her calloused hand. She gripped his knee with the other. She pushed. The joint cracked loudly in the silent room. It sounded like breaking dry wood. Tears spilled from the corners of Leo's eyes, tracking down into his pale hairline. The pain was blinding. "I know it hurts," Martha said flatly, maintaining her relentless grip on his ankle. "Pain is a ledger. It means the flesh is not dead. It means you are still in there."
The authority vested in me,
She pushed again,
I hereby sentence you to be
slowly,
hanged by the neck until death.
brutally. She
sorry,
forced the knee to bend 1 inch, then 2 inches. She forced the stagnant blood to move. She worked the stiffened tendons like a blacksmith working cold iron. She worked for an hour. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the pale dust of the room and settling into her deep scar. Her back screamed in agony from leaning over the heavy bed. She did not stop. When she was finished, Leo lay completely exhausted. But his legs were no longer perfectly straight. They were slightly bent at the knees.
See, Elias,
It
this
was
is
a
all for the
microscopic
best.
victory, but it defied the
help
doctor's absolute sentence. Martha pulled the heavy quilts back over him. She picked up the bucket of cooling water. Before she left, she looked at the boy. His pupils were still dilated, but the sheer animal panic was gone. He looked at her not as a monster, but as a force of nature. "Tomorrow night," Martha said, "we do it again." She turned and left the east room, locking the heavy oak door behind her. This became the secret rhythm of the house. By day, Martha was the silent, scarred beast of burden. She chopped the wood, boiled the sheets, and scrubbed the floors until her hands bled. Elias rode to town,
Changes anything?
broke through the snowpack, and paid the doctor for more medicine. But by night, the real battle was fought.
The law's the law.
Every night at midnight, Martha
It's got a job
unlocked
to
the
do.
east room. She poured the bitter charcoal root down the boy's throat to flush the poison from his liver. She boiled the water. She wrapped the legs. She bent the joints. On the seventh night, Martha was working on Leo's right ankle. She was applying heavy pressure to the sole of his foot, forcing the tendons to stretch. Suddenly, she felt a distinct physical resistance. It was not gravity. It was not rigor mortis.
Sign
It was
Elias.
a push.
You have no choice.
Martha froze. She looked down at her hands. She slowly relaxed her grip on the boy's foot. She looked up at Leo's face. The boy was staring directly into her eyes. His brow was furrowed in immense, excruciating concentration. A bead of sweat rolled down his pale cheek. Slowly, deliberately, the big toe on his right foot twitched. It flexed downward, digging into the palm of Martha's hand. It was a tiny, insignificant movement. But in the silent, suffocating darkness of the east room, it was a thunderclap. The paralysis was breaking. The secret of the night began to bleed into the day. Martha was paying the physical toll. Working the heavy farm chores from dawn to dusk and breaking a child's paralysis from midnight to 3 in the morning
You have
was
no
a
idea
brutal,
what you're up against.
unnatural arithmetic. Her eye sockets grew bruised and hollow. Her movements became stiff. The blisters on her hands never had time to heal, tearing open anew every morning on the frozen axe handle. Elias noticed. He was a man blinded by grief, but he was not a fool. He knew the limits of human endurance. He saw her leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen one afternoon, her eyes closed, her chest
just walk
rising
in
and
here and take
falling
it
in a
all?
state of
After
absolute
everything
exhaustion.
I've done?
She looked like a timber beam on the verge of splintering under
No.
too much weight. That evening at dinner, Elias did something unprecedented. Martha set the iron skillet of salted beef on the table. She took her small, meager portion and retreated to her stool by the stove. Elias sat at the table.
Ain't mud gonna
He
touch
took
this
his knife.
house.
He cut the
I'm
largest,
still
thickest
breathing.
piece of beef from the center of the skillet. He did not put it on his plate. He stood up. He walked over to the stove. He placed the heavy cut of meat directly onto Martha's tin plate. He did not say a word. He did not offer a soft smile. He simply walked back to his chair and ate the remaining scraps. It was a silent acknowledgement. She was keeping his house alive. He would keep her standing. But the true shift happened on the 12th night. The winter wind had died down, leaving the ranch submerged in a ringing, heavy silence. Elias lay in his bed on the ground floor. He could not sleep. The phantom ache of his ruined family kept him awake, staring at the raw
You think you
wooden
can just walk in
ceiling.
here and dictate
Then
terms to me?
he heard
You are
it.
nothing but a
It
pathetic
was
little
faint,
worm. Harsh you
a
was.
dull, rhythmic thud, thud, thud. It was coming from upstairs. Elias threw off his heavy
Sheriff, I
wool
want this
blankets.
matter handled
The
discreetly.
cold of the room bit
See to it
into his
personally.
skin. He pulled on his trousers and grabbed the heavy iron poker from the dead fireplace. His jaw tightened. The rule was absolute. No one went into the east room. He climbed the stairs in the dark. He did not bother to muffle his heavy footsteps. If there was a thief or an animal, he wanted it to know he was coming. He reached the landing. The heavy oak door of the east room was ajar. A sliver of warm orange light spilled out onto the dusty floorboards. Elias gripped the iron poker. He kicked the door wide open. "Get away from him!" Elias roared, his voice shattering the silence of the house like a cannon blast. He froze. The iron poker hung uselessly by his side.
You really thought this would be
The
yours?
room was
How
sweltering.
quaint.
The
How
iron
utterly
stove was
pathetic.
roaring. Martha was
This house
kneeling
is
on the
nothing
floor
but
beside
cold
the
stone
bed.
and shadows.
Her sleeves were rolled up past her elbows. A wooden bucket of steaming water sat beside her. She had both of her calloused hands wrapped firmly around Leo's left calf, physically forcing the knee to bend back and forth. Martha did not flinch at Elias's roar. She did not drop the boy's leg. She simply turned her head and looked at the father. Her scarred face was flushed red from the heat and the immense physical labor. Elias stepped into the room, his chest heaving with adrenaline and sudden, blinding rage. "I gave you one rule," he gritted out, his voice shaking with fury. "One rule. You do not touch my son. You are killing him." The doctor said he must remain completely still. He crossed the room in 3 heavy strides. He reached out to grab Martha by her apron to physically throw her out of the room. "Look at him," Martha said. Her voice was not loud. It was a low, heavy command that cut straight through his panic. Elias stopped. His hand hovered an inch from Martha's shoulder. He looked at his son. Elias expected to see the boy in the throes of a cardiac spasm. He expected to see the terrifying, wide-eyed suffocation that always followed the doctor's visits. Instead, he saw color. The translucent, milky pallor of the boy's skin was gone. His cheeks were flushed red from the heat and the exertion. His chest was rising and falling with deep, strong, rhythmic breaths. But more importantly, his eyes were not fully dilated black pits. They were normal, and they were looking directly at Elias. "Papa," Leo whispered. The word was raspy and weak, unused for months, but it was clear. It was not a whimper of pain. It was a greeting. Elias dropped the iron poker. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, dead clang. He fell to his knees on the opposite side of the bed. His hands trembled violently. He reached out, terrified to touch the boy, terrified he would break the illusion. Slowly, Leo's right hand moved. The fingers uncurled. The arm lifted an inch off the heavy quilt. The boy pushed his hand weakly against Elias's rough, trembling palm. Elias let out a sound that tore from the very bottom of his chest. It was a dry, agonizing sob of a man who had been drowning for 2 years and had just broken the surface of the water. He pressed his face into the heavy quilts beside his son's hand. He did not weep loudly. He just shook. Martha let go of the boy's leg. She pulled the covers down to keep him warm. She picked up her empty wooden bucket. She knew how to leave a room when she was no longer the most important thing in it. She turned to walk toward the door. "Stop!" Elias's voice was thick. He lifted his head from the bed.
Nothing.
He looked at Martha. He saw the dark, bruised exhaustion under her eyes. He saw the angry, blistered burns on her hands from the scalding water. He looked at the amber bottle on the nightstand, and then looked at the bucket of clear water in her hand. He didn't understand the medicine or the poison yet, but he understood reality. The doctor brought silence and fading breath. The scarred laundress brought pain, sweat,
How
and
dare
life.
you? After everything,
He stood
you
up.
stand there and...
He walked around the foot of the bed. He stopped squarely
You
in
have no
front of
business
her.
here, Sheriff.
Elias looked at her,
Not tonight.
not as a servant, not as a broken woman to be hidden away in a kitchen, but as the only solid thing left in his house. He reached out.
You know why I'm here, Elias.
His large, rough hand gently took the heavy wooden handle of the bucket from her blistered fingers. "Go to sleep, Martha," he said quietly. His voice had lost its mechanical hollow. It was human again. "I will finish the fire." Martha released the bucket. She nodded once. She walked out of the room. The boundary was officially crossed. The rules of the house were dead. Now, they were a unified front, and they had exactly 2 weeks to prepare before the true enemy returned. The next morning, the kitchen felt fundamentally altered. Elias did not go straight to the barn at 5
I'm
o'clock.
afraid the prognosis is
He sat
final.
at the heavy oak
The land is
table.
forfeit.
He watched Martha build the fire. He
I'm
watched
afraid
the
the prognosis
deliberate,
is terminal.
efficient way her calloused
Tensions
hands
required
moved over the
advances,
iron
nothing more will
stove.
be done.
She poured 2 cups of bitter black coffee. She set one in front of him. She sat on the stool opposite the table.
I'm so
"What was in the bottle?"
very sorry
Elias
for your
asked.
loss.
The question was heavy, stripped of all pretense. Martha looked at the dark liquid in her cup. "Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade. It is a poison. It suppresses the nervous system. It paralyzes the muscles. In
Thanks
heavy
for closing.
doses,
There's nothing
it
more I
stops
can
the
do.
lungs." Elias closed his eyes. The muscles in his jaw locked tight. "And what did you give him?" "Charcoal powder, burdock root." "White willow? To bind the poison and strip it from his blood," Martha said flatly. "The medicine was the sickness. The paralysis was a lie." Elias stood up. He walked into the parlor. He returned a moment later carrying a heavy metal lockbox. He dropped it onto the kitchen table. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud. He unlocked it with a small brass key. He pulled out a stack
Law's
of
the law.
pristine white papers.
And it's got a
They
job
were
to do.
legal documents. Clara's sister, my wife, left a trust, Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If Leo dies before his 18th birthday, the inheritance reverts entirely to Clara. The doctor has been pressuring me to sell the lower valley to him to cover the medical debts.
You have no
They were
idea
bleeding
what
me
you're
dry.
up against.
They were waiting for my son to suffocate in his own bed, and I was paying them to do it." Elias's hands began to shake, not with grief, with
think you can
absolute
just waltz in here and
blinding
take it all?
rage.
After everything
He
I've
turned
done?
away from the table. He walked toward the heavy oak door. He reached up and took his Winchester repeating rifle down from the iron hooks above the frame. He checked the action. The heavy clack-clack of the lever echoed in the quiet kitchen. "I am going to town," Elias said. His eyes were slate gray and utterly dead. "I am going to put a bullet through his skull, and then hers." Martha stood up. She walked across the room. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She reached out and wrapped her raw, blistered hand tightly around the cold steel barrel of the rifle. Elias stopped. He looked down at her scarred hand, then up to her ruined face. "Gunfire makes them martyrs, Elias," Martha said. Her voice was cold iron. "A bullet turns a greedy doctor into a tragic victim. It gives them the dignity of a sudden death. They do not deserve dignity." Elias's chest heaved. "They are murdering my son." "They are trying," Martha corrected. "But we are awake now. If you kill them, the sheriff hangs you. Leo becomes an orphan. Clara takes the trust anyway. The law does not care about your anger. The law only cares about proof." She pushed down on the barrel of the rifle, forcing it toward the floorboards. Elias resisted for a fraction of a second. Then his grip loosened. He let her push the weapon down. "What do we do?" he asked. "We do the work," Martha said. "We wait for the snow to melt. We let them come to us, and we let Leo be the proof." The next 2 weeks were a crucible. The secret was absolute. During the day, Elias maintained the facade of the broken, grieving father. But at night, the East Room became a forge. Elias joined Martha in the midnight therapy. He lent his massive, calloused hands to the brutal work of bending the child's stiffened joints. He learned the silent language. He learned to breathe with his son when the pain became blinding. Leo fought like a starved wolf. The poison was leaving his system, but the muscle atrophy was real. On the 18th night, Martha stood Leo up beside the bed. Elias hovered 2 inches away, his hands ready to catch the boy. "Hold your own weight," Martha commanded. Leo's bare feet trembled violently against the cold floorboards. His knees buckled inward. Sweat poured down his face. He let out a sharp cry of pain, but he did not collapse. He locked his jaw. He forced his weakened muscles to hold the bone upright. He stood alone for 5 seconds. It was a monumental, shattering victory. Elias caught him as his legs gave out, burying his face in his son's thin shoulder. Martha stepped back into the shadows and began to clean the basin. The winter began to break. The punishing winds subsided. The deep snowpack began to turn gray and slushy under the pale March sun. The dirt track leading to the ranch transformed into thick, heavy mud. The isolation was ending. The world was returning. On a Friday morning, as Martha was hanging the clean, belladonna-free sheets on the clothesline, she saw it. Far down the valley, moving slowly through the thick mud of the road, a heavy black carriage. It was a week early. They were not waiting for the end of the month. They were coming to finalize the kill. Martha did not panic. She did not drop the wet sheets. She calmly pinned the last corner of the white cotton to the line. She watched it snap in the crisp breeze. She turned and walked into the barn. Elias was sharpening an axe on the grinding stone. The sharp screech of steel on stone filled the air. Martha stopped beside him. "They are here," she said quietly. Elias stopped turning the stone. He lowered the axe. He looked out the barn doors toward the approaching carriage. His slate-gray eyes were no longer empty. They were terrifyingly clear. "Set the table for 4, Elias said. The trap was sprung. The heavy black carriage fought the mud. The wet earth sucked violently at the wooden spokes, threatening to pull the expensive vehicle down into the muck. The horses foamed at the mouth, whipped forward by the impatient driver. Elias did not walk out to meet them. He stood on the splintered wood of the front porch. He did not hold his hat in his hands. He stood perfectly straight, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway. He looked like an iron gate. Inside the kitchen, the temperature was sweltering. Martha had built the fire in the stove to a roaring, blinding heat. She placed 4 heavy iron plates on the scrubbed oak table. She set out the tin cups. She did not tremble. Her hands were steady, entirely calloused against fear. The carriage finally halted. The door swung open. Clara stepped down. Her polished black boots sank an inch into the freezing mud. She let out a sharp, aristocratic hiss of disgust. She wore a heavy cloak of deep burgundy wool, lined with silver fox fur. It was completely dry. It was the armor of a woman who had never known a day of physical labor. Dr. Harrison emerged behind her. He carried his swollen leather medical bag, but he was not alone. A third man stepped down from the carriage. He wore a silver star pinned to his heavy canvas coat. Sheriff Miller. He carried a thick leather folio tucked tightly under his arm. The external storm had arrived, and it brought the law. Elias watched them approach. His slate-gray eyes tracked the leather folio in the sheriff's hands. The trap was perfectly set, but seeing the steel jaws of it still sent a cold spike of adrenaline through his chest. "Elias," Clara called out, picking her way carefully up the rotten wooden steps. She did not smile. "A dreadful journey. Simply dreadful. The mud is knee-deep in the lower valley." "It is March," Elias said. His voice was completely flat. "The ice breaks." "Indeed," Dr. Harrison said, stepping onto the porch and stomping his expensive boots. He did not look at Elias with sympathy today. He looked at him with the cold, calculating gaze of a man evaluating a ledger. "We are early, Elias. The boy's condition requires immediate consultation. Sheriff Miller has accompanied us to ensure everything is handled properly." Sheriff Miller nodded once, avoiding Elias's eyes. He was a man who preferred enforcing the law on poor drunks, not grieving landowners. Just here in an official capacity, Elias. Papers to file. Elias turned completely around. He opened the heavy oak door. He did not invite them in. He simply let them follow. They entered the kitchen. The intense heat of the roaring stove hit them like a physical wall. Martha stood in the corner by the wash basin. She wiped her wet, blistered hands on her coarse apron. She did not lower her head. She looked directly at Clara. Clara froze. The heavy scent of lavender perfume clashed violently with the smell of boiling coffee and hot iron. Clara looked at the 4 plates set on the table. Then she looked at the scarred wreckage of Martha's face. The revulsion was immediate and entirely undisguised. "What is this?" Clara demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She pointed a gloved finger at the table. "You have set a place for the beast? I will not sit at a table with a creature that looks like melted wax. Get her out of my sight, Elias. Now." Dr. Harrison set his heavy medical bag on the floor. He scowled. "I warned you about this, Elias. The boy's environment must be kept pristine. This woman is an infection." Martha did not move. She did not speak. She simply shifted her gaze from Clara to Elias. Elias stood at the head of the table. He looked at Clara. He looked at the doctor. "She stays," Elias said. The 2 words dropped into the room like heavy stones. Clara scoffed loudly, a harsh, ugly sound. "Have you lost your mind to the grief, Elias? She is a hired hand, a filthy laundress. Send her to the barn where she belongs." Elias placed his large, calloused hands flat on the oak table. He leaned forward slightly. "She cooks the meals," Elias said. His voice dropped an octave, resonating with a dark, terrifying calmness. "She scrubs the floors. She keeps the fires burning. In this house, the ones who do the work stay in the room. Sit down, Clara." The kitchen went dead silent. The wind howling outside suddenly felt very far away. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat uncomfortably. He unbuttoned his coat. "Now, Elias, no need for hostility. We have difficult business to attend to. Let's just sit." Clara's face flushed an angry mottled red beneath her powder. She glared at Martha with absolute venom, but she pulled out a wooden chair and sat. She refused to take off her heavy fur cloak. Dr. Harrison sat next to her. Sheriff Miller remained standing, placing the heavy leather folio directly onto the center of the table, pushing aside a tin cup to make room. Martha quietly walked over to her low wooden stool by the stove. She sat down. The heat radiated into her spine. She folded her scarred hands in her lap. She became entirely still, an observer, a witness. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries, Elias," Dr. Harrison said, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "I evaluated Leo extensively during my last visit. The paralysis has reached his upper torso. His heart is struggling to pump against the deadened nerves. The tonics are no longer sufficient." Elias looked at him. "So he is dying." Clara pulled a lace handkerchief from her sleeve and dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes. "It is a tragedy, Elias, a heavy, unbearable cross. But we must be practical. We must ensure his final days are spent in absolute comfort." "Practical," Elias repeated. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Sheriff Miller untied the leather string of his folio. He opened it. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents and heavy ledgers. "Dr. Harrison has submitted his medical bills to the county clerk, Elias," the sheriff said, his voice dropping into a formal bureaucratic drone. "The total is staggering. You have exhausted your cash reserves. You are officially in arrears." Dr. Harrison reached into his jacket. He pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the table toward Elias. "I am not an unreasonable man, Elias," the doctor said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "I know you cannot pay. but I cannot continue to supply the expensive syrups for free. However, I have drafted a deed of transfer, sign over the lower valley pasture to my practice. It will clear your debt entirely. It will guarantee the boy receives his medicine until the end." Elias looked at the paper. It was a death warrant, not just for his land, but for his son. "And if I refuse?" Elias asked quietly. Sheriff Miller tapped the folio. "Then Dr. Harrison files a medical lien against the entire property by noon tomorrow. The bank seizes the ranch. You lose the house, Elias, and the boy becomes a ward of the state. He will be moved to the county asylum." Clara leaned across the table. Her eyes gleamed with a hungry, predatory light. "Sign the paper, Elias. Save your son the indignity of dying in a cold asylum. Do it for my sister's memory." The trap had snapped shut. The antagonist had struck. They had used the law to corner a grieving father into selling his own child's life. Elias stared at the paper. He did not reach for a pen. He slowly lifted his head. He looked past Clara. He looked past the doctor. He looked entirely through them, his gaze fixing on the dark hallway leading to the stairs. "I don't think I'll be signing that, Doctor," Elias said. Dr. Harrison slammed his fist onto the table. The iron plates rattled. "Are you mad? You would condemn your own son to the asylum out of sheer stubborn pride?" "No," Elias said. His voice was no longer flat. It was vibrating with a terrifying, suppressed energy. "I am not condemning him to anything." Elias looked toward the stove. He met Martha's eyes. Martha did not smile. She simply gave a single microscopic nod. It was time. Dr. Harrison's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly contempt. He scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that bounced off the wooden walls. "You are a fool, Elias," the doctor spat. He reached across the table and snatched the deed of transfer back. "You choose pride over your son's comfort. Sheriff, prepare the lien. I want the bank notified before sundown. We are done here." Sheriff Miller sighed. It was the sigh of a man who hated his job but loved his pension. He dipped his heavy, iron-nibbed pen into the glass inkwell. The metallic scratch against the glass was the only sound in the sweltering kitchen, until the ceiling groaned. It was a heavy structural sound. It came from directly above them, the floorboards of the upper hall. Clara rolled her eyes. She pulled her burgundy cloak tighter around her throat. "Rats in the woodwork. Add that to the list of your miserable failures, Elias. This house is a tomb." Elias did not look at the ceiling. He kept his slate-gray eyes entirely on Clara. He waited. Creak. It was not a rat. Rats scurried. This sound was deliberate. It was the sound of substantial weight being transferred onto old, protesting pine boards. "Doctor." Harrison frowned. He looked up at the ceiling, irritated by the interruption. "Did you leave a window open upstairs? The draft is slamming a door." Martha sat motionless on her wooden stool by the stove. She knew the exact geometry of the house. She knew the rhythm of the wind. That sound was not a draft. It was a footstep. Thud. A heavy, dragging step right above their heads. Sheriff Miller stopped writing. A drop of black ink fell from his pen, staining the legal folio like a dark bruise. He looked at Elias. "Is there someone else in the house?" "Just my family," Elias said. His voice was carved from ice. Thud. Creak. The sound reached the top of the dark staircase. The color began to drain from Dr. Harrison's face. The arrogant flush vanished, leaving him a sickly pale gray. He looked at Elias, then toward the open black archway of the hall. "Who is up there, Elias?" No one answered him. The silence in the kitchen became a physical, suffocating weight. Then the descent began. It was agonizingly slow. Step, drag, pause. The wood of the stairs screamed under the tension. It was the sound of a desperate, brutal physical struggle. Someone was fighting gravity. Someone was fighting weakness. Someone was violently breaking every medical law Dr. Harrison had written into his ledgers. Clara stood up slowly. The heavy fox fur slipped off her shoulders and pooled on the dirty floorboards. She did not notice. Her face was completely devoid of blood. She clutched the edge of the oak table, her knuckles turning white. "Elias," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Who is on those stairs?" "My heir," Elias said quietly. "Step, drag, pause." The shadow in the hallway shifted. A small, pale hand emerged from the gloom. It clamped violently onto the edge of the wooden banister at the bottom of the stairs. The small joints were locked tight. The veins stood out blue and strained against translucent skin. Then a bare foot stepped down onto the bottom landing. The kitchen froze. The air was sucked entirely from the room. Leo stepped into the light. He wore a thin white cotton nightshirt. It hung loosely off his emaciated frame. He was drenched in sweat. His dark hair was plastered flat against his forehead. His bare legs were shaking so violently it looked as though his bones were vibrating against each other. He was breathing in heavy, ragged, open-mouthed gasps. But he was standing. He was standing entirely on his own 2 feet. Dr. Harrison stumbled backward. His heavy boots caught the leg of his wooden chair. He tipped backward. The chair crashed violently to the floor. The doctor did not get up. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees until his back hit the cupboards. His eyes were wide, completely dilated with absolute, unadulterated shock. The medical impossibility stood breathing before him. "Good God," Sheriff Miller whispered. His hands went numb. He dropped the iron pen. It clattered against the floorboards, rolling away into the dust. Clara began to tremble. Her entire body shook against the table. The aristocratic sneer was completely eradicated. It was replaced by the raw animal terror of a cornered predator facing the ghost of its victim. "Leo!" Clara gasped. Her voice was a thin, reedy squeak. It sounded exactly like the helpless whimpers the boy used to make in the dark. Leo did not look at his father. He did not look at the sheriff. He fixed his gaze entirely on his Aunt Clara. His eyes were clear. The heavy, dark pits of the poison were gone. He saw her exactly for what she was, a monster wrapped in lavender and velvet. He let go of the banister. He took one agonizing step forward into the center of the kitchen. He swayed, but he locked his knees. He held his ground. "I am not dying," the 8-year-old boy said. His voice was raspy. It was weak from disuse. But in the suffocating silence of the room, it struck like a physical blow. Dr. Harrison clutched his chest, pointing a trembling finger at the child. "This is a trick, a spasm. The dead nerves are firing erratically. It is a death throw. He will collapse." Martha stood up from her stool. She did not rush. She moved with the steady, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. She walked from the shadows of the stove directly to the heavy oak table. She reached deep into the large canvas pockets of her coarse apron. "He is not collapsing, Doctor," Martha said. Her voice was a low, heavy rumble that filled the room. "He is awake." She pulled her hands from her pockets. She slammed 3 heavy, empty amber glass bottles down onto the center of the table. They hit the wood right on top of the doctor's medical bills with a sharp, violent crash. The labels were perfectly intact. Dr. Harrison's restorative elixir. "You missed one thing, Doctor, when you were counting Elias's money," Martha said. She leaned over the table, bringing her ruined, scarred face inches from Dr. Harrison's trembling, pale features. "You thought you were the only one who knew how to smell a poison." Sheriff Miller stared at the 3 amber bottles on the table. The legal folio, with its demands for land and money, was suddenly forgotten beneath the heavy glass. He slowly reached out. His hand was no longer numb. It was the steady, deliberate hand of a lawman who had just realized a murder was occurring directly in front of him. He picked up one of the empty bottles. He pulled the cork. He brought the rim to his nose. Sheriff Miller was not a doctor, but he was a man of the frontier. He knew the smell of horse liniment, of stale whiskey, and of gangrene. He took a short breath. He recoiled instantly, his thick mustache twitching in disgust. "That is sweet," the sheriff muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "It smells like rotting berries. Medicine for the heart is supposed to be bitter. It's supposed to smell like camphor." "It is not medicine," Martha said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The truth was heavy enough to crush the room on its own. "It is atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, highly concentrated." Dr. Harrison scrambled to his feet. He knocked his fallen chair aside. His face was slick with terrified sweat. He pointed a shaking finger at Martha. "She is a liar," the doctor screamed. The refined aristocratic veneer was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate shrieking of a cornered rat. "Look at her. She's a burned, ignorant beast. She knows nothing of modern medicine. That is a proprietary tincture, a complex formula to soothe the nerves." Martha ignored him. She looked only at the sheriff. "Belladonna dilates the pupils to black pits," Martha said mechanically, stating physical facts like a coroner reading a report. "It freezes the muscles. It slows the lungs until the blood turns dark. He was not dying of a natural wasting disease, Sheriff. He was being artificially paralyzed, dose by dose, night by night." "Preposterous!" Dr. Harrison yelled, taking a step toward the table. He reached for the bottles to sweep them onto the floor. "I will not have my reputation ruined by a scarred vagrant." Before the doctor's hand could touch the glass, Elias moved. It was terrifyingly fast. Elias did not punch the doctor. He did not yell. He simply reached out his massive, calloused hand and clamped it directly onto Dr. Harrison's tailored collar. He lifted the smaller man 2 inches off the floorboards and slammed him backward against the heavy wooden cupboards. The impact rattled the iron pots hanging from the hooks. Elias held the doctor pinned against the wood. The slate-gray eyes were practically burning. "You let her speak," Elias whispered. The threat of immense physical violence hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Sheriff Miller did not tell Elias to release the man. The sheriff looked at Leo, who was still standing upright, his chest heaving, his eyes clear and focused. Then the sheriff looked back to Martha. "If it was poison," Sheriff Miller asked slowly, "how is the boy standing?" Martha walked over to the roaring stove. She picked up the small iron pot where she had boiled her roots. She brought it to the table and set it down next to the sheriff's folio. "Charcoal," Martha said, "burdock root, white willow. Every night after the father went to sleep, I forced this down the boy's throat. It bound the poison. It stripped the nightshade from his liver. And then I boiled water, and I forced his dead legs to bend. I broke the paralysis with heat and friction." Clara stood frozen by the table. The reality of the situation was crashing down upon her. The meticulous 2-year plan to legally murder a child and seize a fortune was disintegrating in a filthy kitchen, dismantled by a woman she had deemed entirely subhuman. Clara immediately tried to sever the dying limb. She turned on the doctor. "He told me it was medicine," Clara cried out. Her voice was shrill, perfectly mimicking absolute betrayal. She pressed her hands to her chest. "Sheriff, you must believe me. I paid him out of my own sister's trust to save my nephew. The doctor deceived us all." Dr. Harrison choked against Elias's grip. His eyes bulged. "You lying harlot! It was your idea. You paid me double my rate to keep the dosage high." "Lies!" Clara shrieked, backing away toward the door. "He is trying to drag me down with his madness. Elias, surely you see I am innocent." Martha did not let the chaos take root. She was the anchor of the room. She turned to the sheriff. "There is a way to know for sure, Sheriff," Martha said flatly. Sheriff Miller looked at her. "How?" Martha pointed to the floor. "The doctor brought his medical bag today. He came to administer the final dose. The dose that would have stopped the boy's heart permanently so they could collect the deed by sunset." The room went dead silent again. Clara stopped backing away. Dr. Harrison stopped struggling against Elias's grip. All eyes fell upon the swollen, heavy leather medical bag resting on the floorboards near the door. "Open the bag, Sheriff," Martha said. "Check the new bottle. If it is genuine heart medicine, it will be thin and bitter. If it is poison, it will be thick, sweet, and smell exactly like the empty bottles on this table." Sheriff Miller looked at the bag. He walked over to it. The heavy leather boots hit the floorboards with finality. He knelt down. He unbuckled the brass straps. "No!" Dr. Harrison shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated panic. He tried to lunge forward, but Elias slammed him back against the cupboards with bone-rattling force. Sheriff Miller opened the bag. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a large, freshly sealed amber bottle. The sheriff pulled it out. He popped the fresh cork. He didn't even need to bring it to his nose. The thick, cloying, rotting sweet smell of Atropa belladonna immediately filled the hot air of the kitchen. It was undeniable. It was physical proof of attempted murder. Sheriff Miller stood up. He held the open bottle of poison in his left hand. His right hand instinctively dropped to rest on the heavy iron grip of his revolver. He looked at Dr. Harrison. He looked at Clara. "Well now," Sheriff Miller said softly. The bureaucratic drone was entirely gone. "Looks like we aren't filing any medical liens today." Sheriff Miller pulled a pair of heavy iron handcuffs from his leather belt. The metal clinked sharply in the quiet kitchen. It was the sound of reality crashing down. "You have the right to remain silent, Doctor," Sheriff Miller said, his voice stripped of all its former bureaucratic deference, "though I reckon you've done enough silencing for one lifetime." Elias opened his massive hand. He stepped back. Dr. Harrison collapsed onto the floorboards. He gasped violently for air, clutching his tailored collar. He did not look arrogant now. Stripped of his medical authority and exposed by physical evidence, he looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken. The heavy ledger of his crimes had finally crushed him. Clara backed rapidly toward the front door. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She reached down with trembling hands and snatched her heavy fox fur cloak from the floor. "I am leaving," Clara announced, her voice pitching up into a hysterical, defensive shrill. She refused to look at the handcuffs. "I will contact my attorney in the city. This is an outrage. You have absolutely no proof of my involvement. I was merely a concerned relative." Leo shifted his weight. His bare feet gripped the rough pine floorboards. "You held the cup, Aunt Clara," the 8-year-old boy said. The kitchen went entirely still. The fire in the stove seemed to hold its breath. Clara froze. She slowly turned her head to look at the emaciated child she had spent 2 years trying to erase. "You held the cup?" Leo repeated. His voice was raspy, but it was terrifyingly clear. He did not blink. "When Papa was out chopping wood, you held my nose. You poured the sweet syrup down my throat. You told me it would make me sleep forever so Papa wouldn't have to be sad anymore." Clara's jaw slackened. The thick layer of pale powder on her face cracked. The illusion of her aristocratic innocence shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. She could not gaslight the victim who was standing right in front of her. The town lady was dead. Only the murderer remained. Sheriff Miller didn't say another word to her. He simply pulled a second pair of iron cuffs from his heavy canvas coat. He walked over to Clara. She did not fight. The absolute truth had severed her tendons. Her knees buckled. She sank down onto the dirty, freshly scrubbed floorboards. The heavy purple wool of her expensive dress soaked up the spilled, muddy slush tracked in by the doctor's boots. It ruined the fabric entirely. The sheriff clamped the cold iron over her delicate, gloved wrists. The metallic click was final. He hauled Dr. Harrison roughly to his feet by his coat collar. He pushed the doctor toward the door, forcing Clara to stumble upright and follow. At the threshold, Sheriff Miller paused. He turned back. He looked at Elias, who was standing tall. the heavy burden of grief visibly lifting from his shoulders. He looked at the boy standing on his own 2 feet. And finally the lawman looked at Martha, the scarred, silent woman standing quietly by the roaring stove. "Elias," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "I'll be back tomorrow with the county magistrate. We'll tear up those medical debts. The state will seize his practice and her accounts. They're going to the penitentiary for a very long time." Elias simply nodded. He did not gloat. He did not yell. He had his son. Sheriff Miller led the 2 prisoners out onto the porch. He did not let them ride in the carriage. He ordered his deputy to drive the carriage back empty. The sheriff mounted his horse. He tied the chain of the handcuffs to his saddle horn. Dr. Harrison and Aunt Clara were forced to walk behind the horse. They trudged through the freezing, knee-deep mud of the March thaw. The thick muck ruined Clara's polished leather boots. It splattered against the doctor's tailored charcoal coat. They slipped and stumbled, dragged forward by the slow, relentless pace of the law. It was a slow, agonizing public march back to the town they thought they ruled. They would enter the main street completely covered in filth, bound in iron for every judgmental eye to see. The humiliation was absolute. Inside the house, the heavy oak door closed shut. The iron latch clicked into place. The external storm was gone. The adrenaline that had held Leo upright suddenly evaporated. The boy's knees violently buckled. Elias was there in a fraction of a second. He caught his son before the boy hit the floor. He lifted the 8-year-old up into his arms, holding him tightly against his chest. Leo buried his face in his father's rough flannel shirt, his small hands gripping the fabric with desperate living strength. "I've got you," Elias whispered into his son's dark hair. The tears finally fell from the father's eyes, hot and fast, tracking through the sawdust and grime on his face. "I've got you. It's over." Martha watched them from the stove. She did not intrude on the embrace. She did not wait for a thank you. Her job was done. The truth was exposed. The house was safe. She turned around. She picked up her stiff bristle brush. She knelt down on the floorboards right where Clara had knelt and began to silently scrub the mud from the wood. The mud of the main street was deep and unforgiving. News on the frontier traveled faster than a telegraph wire. By the time Sheriff Miller's horse crested the final hill leading into town, a crowd had already gathered on the wooden boardwalks. They were the same people who had whispered about the cursed widower. They were the same people who had recoiled from the scarred laundress. Now they stood in absolute stunned silence. Sheriff Miller rode slowly down the center of the street. Behind his horse, tethered by a heavy iron chain, walked the 2 pillars of their society. Dr. Harrison's tailored charcoal coat was heavy with wet, freezing muck. He limped, his expensive leather boots ruined and dragging. He kept his head down, unable to meet the eyes of the patients he had overcharged for years. Clara was a vision of shattered vanity. Her heavy burgundy wool dress, once a symbol of her untouchable wealth, was caked to the knees in thick brown sludge. The pristine silver fox fur collar was matted and stained. She shivered violently in the biting wind. She looked up once, searching the crowd for a sympathetic face. She found none. The town preacher, who had often dined at Clara's immaculate table, stepped back from the edge of the boardwalk. He turned his face away. The bank manager, who had gleefully prepared to seize Elias's land, pulled his hat down low and retreated into the shadows of the apothecary awning. There was no lynch mob. There were no shouted insults. There was only the crushing collective realization of their own hypocrisy. They had judged a woman by her scars while the true monsters had been wearing tailored wool and carrying medical degrees. The silence of the town was a heavier punishment than the iron cuffs. It was the sound of complete social annihilation. Sheriff Miller led them directly to the brick jailhouse. The heavy iron door clanged shut. The sound echoed down the quiet street. a definitive period at the end of a long, dark sentence. The legal reckoning was swift, cold, and entirely constructed of paper. The county magistrate arrived 2 days later. He did not ask for impassioned speeches. He simply looked at the 3 empty amber bottles, smelled the thick, sweet residue in the fresh one, and read the doctor's own forged medical ledgers. The evidence was mathematical. It was undeniable. The magistrate brought a heavy rubber stamp down onto Dr. Harrison's medical license, revoked. He brought the stamp down onto the deed of transfer, null and void. He brought the stamp down onto Clara's control of the inheritance trust, terminated. The bank seized Dr. Harrison's practice by noon to pay the restitution owed to Elias. Clara's fine porcelain and imported furniture were auctioned off in the town square to cover the legal fees. They were stripped of their wealth, their titles, and their freedom. They were sentenced to the state penitentiary. 20 years of hard labor for attempted murder and grand fraud. There would be no lavender perfume in the prison laundry. There would be no delicate tea times in the stone quarry. They would spend the rest of their lives learning exactly what it meant to break their backs in the dark. The external world had balanced its ledger. Back at the ranch, the internal world began to heal. Spring broke the spine of the winter. The pale, bruised sky turned a sharp, clean blue. The snowmelt flooded the dead yellow grass, turning the lower valley into a vibrant, brilliant green. The rotting split-rail fence was torn down. The yard was cleared of the abandoned timber. The pacing of the house slowed down. The desperate, frantic energy of survival was replaced by the steady, measured rhythm of living. Martha still woke at 4 a.m. She still chopped the wood. She still scrubbed the floors. But the labor was no longer a frantic fortress against pain. It was simply work. It was the necessary maintenance of a life. She stood by the large iron cauldron in the yard. The water was boiling. She dropped the bedsheets in. They were not tiny, sweat-stained squares of cotton. They were large, rough-spun wool blankets from Elias's bed and the heavy linen from her own. She stirred the water with the heavy wooden paddle. The steam rose, warming her face. The raised red tissue of her scar had lost its angry inflammation in the softening weather. She looked toward the porch. Leo was sitting on the wooden steps. He was not wearing a thin nightshirt. He wore heavy denim overalls and a thick flannel shirt. His skin had absorbed the spring sun, turning a healthy golden brown. The translucent fragility was gone. He was holding a piece of pine wood and a small carving knife. He was clumsy with it, his muscles still relearning their fine motor skills. But he was focused. He looked up. He saw Martha watching him. He didn't speak. He just held up the piece of wood. It was crudely shaped but recognizable. It was a horse. Martha gave a single microscopic nod. She turned back to the cauldron. The silence between them was no longer the silence of trauma. It was the silence of understanding. The heavy gloom that had saturated the timber of the house finally lifted. Elias was a changed man. The slate-gray emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by the sharp, focused clarity of a man who had reclaimed his territory. He did not speak of his grief anymore. The grief had been burned away in the fire of his rage and extinguished by the survival of his son. He started repairing the decay. He bought fresh lumber from the town. He did not hire a crew. He did the work himself. The rhythmic, heavy strikes of his iron hammer echoed across the valley from dawn until dusk. He rebuilt the rotting front porch. He fixed the sagging roof. He replaced the shattered glass panes in the windows, letting the bright spring light flood into the parlor. He did not treat Martha as a servant. He treated her as a load-bearing pillar of the property. When he sat at the kitchen table for breakfast, he no longer ate mechanically and walked away. He waited until she poured her own cup of bitter coffee. He slid the heavy iron plate of eggs and salted pork toward the center of the table. They ate in companionable silence. The silence was no longer a forced rule of a bitter widower. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who understood that words were mostly useless. May arrived. The evenings grew warm. The harsh, biting winds of the plains were entirely forgotten. One evening, Martha finished washing the supper dishes. She dried her hands on her flour sack apron. She walked toward the narrow, drafty room adjacent to the pantry. She stopped. The door was gone. The heavy iron hinges had been unscrewed. The doorway was just an empty frame. Martha turned around. Elias stood in the center of the kitchen. He held a heavy iron crowbar in one hand and a brass padlock in the other. He had just returned from the east room upstairs. He had torn the locks off the door. The room was no longer a tomb. It was just a bedroom. He looked at Martha. He walked over to the narrow pantry room. He tossed the brass padlock into the scrap bucket. It hit the metal with a loud final clang. "The roof leaks in there," Elias said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. Martha looked at the empty doorway. "It keeps the wind off." Elias set the crowbar on the table. He walked past her, out the front door, and onto the newly built porch. He reached up to the row of rusted iron hooks by the doorframe. Martha's heavy, frayed gray wool coat was hanging on the last hook, exposed to the elements. It was where the hired help kept their things. It was a sign of a temporary existence. Elias took the coat down. He did not shake the dust from it. He did not try to clean it. He accepted the dirt, the fraying threads, and the hard history woven into the fabric. He walked back inside. He bypassed the kitchen entirely. He walked into the main parlor. He went to the heavy carved wooden coat rack standing right beside the hearth, the center of the home, the place reserved strictly for family. He draped Martha's heavy wool coat over the thickest wooden peg. He turned around and met her gaze. He didn't make a grand speech. He didn't offer a dramatic vow of love or beg for her hand in marriage. Those things belonged in cheap penny dreadfuls and the mouths of hypocritical preachers. They were survivors. They spoke in the language of wood, iron, and shared burdens. "The room at the top of the stairs," Elias said, his eyes perfectly steady. "The one facing south. It catches the morning sun. The floorboards are solid." Martha looked at her coat hanging by the hearth. She looked at the man who had placed it there. The scarred tissue on her face did not throb. Her blistered hands did not ache. For the first time in 10 years, she did not feel the crushing, exhausting weight of having to justify her own existence. She walked over to the stove. She untied her coarse apron and folded it neatly over the back of her wooden stool. She looked at Elias. She gave a single firm nod. She turned and began to walk up the stairs. She didn't walk softly to hide her footsteps. Her heavy leather boots struck the wood with solid, undeniable rhythm. Below her, Elias took a match and struck it against the stone of the hearth. He lit the large glass oil lamp on the center table. The warm, golden light pushed the last remaining shadows out of the corners of the house. They didn't need the town's permission to exist. The lamp burned between them, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.